I honestly don't know what the point of Intel is right now. Prior to February of this year, I had not once considered using AMD as a primary processor for my computer. Intel had the market cornered both in the traditional desktop with the 7700K, but then also with the high-end desktop platform with their 6 to 10 core i7s. Then Ryzen 7 dropped, and I've been on that train ever since. Spending just about $300 on an 8-core processor was an amazing prospect to me. Sure, the IPC wasn't as good as Intel's, and games definitely didn't take advantage of all of these cores, but for my purposes of multitasking and content creation, there wasn't a better deal. Now, Intel is here with their first launch since Ryzen, their X series lineup. And honestly, spoilers, it's fallen flat, at least in my eyes. Today, I'll only be talking about the 8-core 7820X CPU that ASUS South Africa sent over for me to use, but it seems to be a great direct comparison for what AMD was trying to accomplish with their Ryzen 7 lineup. Obviously, if you want a 10-core processor, Intel is still your only option until Threadripper launches in a few months. With the 7820X, what you get is 8 cores, 16 threads with a base clock of 3.6 GHz and a max turbo boost of 4.5 GHz. One of the nice new features of Intel's X series lineup is that with Turbo Boost, you get 2 cores that ramp up to the higher frequency instead of the typical 1 core that's been featured on most other CPU setups. Then there's the traditional HEDT bits like quad-channel memory support, this time with frequencies up to 2666 MHz officially supported, and then 28 PCI Express lanes on the CPU, all with a 140 watt TDP. This has all the makings of a really good processor. And in fact, it's even better than what the support page has listed. Getting my G.Skill Trident Z RAM to its rated 3200 MHz speed was no harder than setting it up in the BIOS. And overclocking this chip to 4.5 GHz on all cores was incredibly easy. Even getting 5 GHz to work required minimal effort. Although keeping that frequency cool and stable are entirely different stories, but at least with a screenshot I can prove I hit it with this chip. 4.5 GHz was the highest but still coolable overclock I could get on the chip with my Corsair H100i V2 240mm radiator, even with dual 120mm fans on both sides. Once you start overclocking this chip, the heat output goes up significantly, nearing the 200 watt mark in many instances. If you have an epic water cooling setup, getting past 4.5 GHz should be no obstacle as long as you can dissipate the heat. Okay, great. The chip is powerful, it's fast, it overclocks well, supports quick memory. Nothing's wrong with any of that. But how does it compare? That's where my concern with Intel really comes in at this point. For the comparison, I didn't use the highest end 1800X from AMD, but rather their lowest setup, the Ryzen 7 1700, to show you just how disparate the numbers will be between AMD and the Skylake X CPUs. For the motherboards, on AMD's side, ASUS let me use their X370 Crosshair 6.0, and on the Intel side, they lent me the X299 ROG Strix E Gaming. Both setups had 32 GB of G.Skill Trident Z RGB RAM running at 2666 MHz with timings of 16, 18, 18, 38, 1T. Surely the $310 8-core can't really compare with the $600 8-core, right? Well, let's look at the numbers to find out. Up first, we'll take a look at the synthetic CPU benchmarks and then get into the gaming ones. With stock settings on both of the chips, the 7820X absolutely blows the doors off of the 1700. 22% advantage in Cinebench R15 multi-core, 37% in single-core. 55% lead in HWBot Prime, 15% and 23% whooping in the W Prime 32M and 1024M tests respectively. A 32% trouncing in Geekbench 4's single-core setup, and a 43% pounding in the multi-core performance. PiFast was 36% faster. SuperPi was 31% quicker with the 1 million setup and 32% faster at the 32 mil. And then finally, the HWBot X265 video encoding task left the 7820X with a 49% lead with a 1080p render and a 52% lead with the 4K render. The 600 MHz added base clock and dual core boost clock definitely helped out the 7820X fantastically here. The 1700 couldn't keep up in any of the tests and just got absolutely slaughtered. However, before we go singing the outright praises of the 7820X, let's even the playing grounds a bit and see what the chips can do when they're both clocked to the same frequency. So for this next set of benchmarks, each CPU was set to 3.6 GHz flat. No boost clock on either, just a fair, even instructions per cycle fistfight. Cinebench R15 doesn't look so hot for Intel now, with the Ryzen 7 1700 CPU taking a 2% victory here in multi-core performance, but the i7-7820X does beat the AMD chip out by 8% in the single-core performance. In HWBot Prime, Intel wins pretty handedly with a 39% victory. W Prime swings the win pendulum back the other way with a 1% victory for AMD with a 32M test and a measly 3% victory for Intel with the 1024M test. Geekbench is also a slimmer margin of victory for the X series chip with only a 7% lead with single-core performance but a 21% lead in multi-core. Intel definitively had a faster render time with PiFast with a 22% lead and a 14% lead with SuperPi 1M and 9% with 32M. HWBot's X265 render test still gives the 7820X a solid victory with a 31% margin with the 1080p video and a 34% margin when the resolution is bumped up to 4K. Intel definitely does still seem to be the stronger CPU, but not by as much as the stock setups would indicate. In a fair fight, the margin of victory from the nearly double the price CPU isn't nearly double the performance. Alright, so clock for clock match is done, but I still did one more test setup to hopefully shine Intel's advantages through a bit more. I overclocked both chips as far as I could get them to go. With the 1700, I had a hard limit of 4 GHz, and with the 7820X, I had a thermal limit of 4.5 GHz. So 4.5 versus 4 with the same RAM setup. Again, obviously, Intel takes all of the victories. Cinebench R15 gives an 8% win in multi-core and 17% in single-core. HWBot Prime bounces back to a 53% victory. W Prime is a 7% and 14% lead in the first and second test respectively. Geekbench is a 14% triumph in single-core and a doubled lead to 28% in multi-core. PiFast is a 28% margin. SuperPi is 21% and 16% with the short and long tests respectively. And then we finally have a successful render win of 43% at 1080p and 50% at 4K with the HWBot X265 test. Intel wins solidly here as one would expect them to. A 12% clock speed advantage led to a more than 12% win in most of the tests, which is a testament to how much better Intel's processes are than AMD's at this point. There's no questioning that. So let's move on to gaming performance. All the testing done here was done at 1080p with the GTX 1080 Ti to remove most GPU bottlenecks and to make it a fair fight between the differing CPUs. Again, RAM speed and timings were as previously mentioned, but I had each CPU overclocked to 4 GHz on all 8 cores. So let's take a look at the synthetic benchmark, Firestrike, first. The 7820X takes a win with a 7% overall higher score count, 3% higher physics count, and a 90% win with the combined CPU and GPU tests that the benchmark runs. Good start. Moving on to Ashes of the Singularity in DirectX 12 at 1080p with crazy settings, the overall frame rate is 25% higher with Intel at the helm, but the CPU frame rate is 44% higher. Quite a solid margin of victory. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is up next in DX12 with very high settings. With both the minimum and average frame rates, Intel has a definitive outside of the margin of error lead with 26% lead in minimum frame rates and a 16% lead in average frame rates. Hitman, DX12 again, proves to give Intel a 14% and 13% lead with both the minimum and average frame rates. Rise of the Tomb Raider, DX12 once more has Intel winning by 17% in minimums and 19% with the average frame rate. Grand Theft Auto 5 in DX11 this time has the 7820X with a 53% minimums victory and 14% averages victory. Okay, great! Intel won all of the tests here. So, Brett, why were you saying you don't know what the point of Intel is right now? Isn't it to be the better CPU? To be a clearly better choice than AMD? To actually do things faster than Team Red? Well, yes and no. There's clearly no better choice on the market right now if you want a high core count, high IPC, fast frequency CPU. Intel has that market hands down. Not to mention the fact that you can have quad channel memory support with up to 128 GB of RAM with 8 versus 4 DIMMs. Those are all amazing competitive advantages for Intel right now, and if you know you need them, then you shouldn't look to AMD at all. Here's where my confusion comes in. At $600 for the i7-7820X, you're not getting $600 worth of performance. Even with all of its victories, the Ryzen 7 1700 CPU remains a better value. If you take all of the frame rates and divide them by the cost of the processor, for the CPU benchmarks, the 1700 is anywhere between a 29% better value based on its 4K HWBot X265 render times to a 170% better value with its PiFast times, at least when you take each CPU at its max overclock. For the gaming benchmarks, the 1700 CPU is between a 60 and 70% better value per frame rate than the 7820X. Even though the i7-7820X is definitively the better processor, it's not nearly 100% better as its price would indicate. Heck, for the $600 that the 7820X costs, I could buy the Ryzen 7 1700 CPU and the X370 Crosshair 6-hero motherboard and still have a few bucks left over. The same is true if you live in South Africa. You can get both the CPU and motherboard for less than the 10,000 Rand that you'll spend on the Intel processor. Now obviously, some of you are likely questioning me on this and comparing the 7820X to the Ryzen 7 1800X, which is in the same ballpark cost-wise. Surely the 7820X is a better value than the 1800X. I would agree with that statement. If I was forced to choose between those two CPUs, I would take the Intel one hands down. But that vacuum choice doesn't exist, and AMD did release the cheaper, better value 8-core processor, which is the reason why when I was buying my AMD setup, I didn't for 1 second consider the 1800X. It's just a bad value choice, with most of the 17 and 1700X chips able to overclock to nearly the same levels. Not only does the Ryzen 7 1700 CPU put its older brother, the 1800X, in a weird place, it definitely does so to Intel's high-end desktop line as well. I personally can't be convinced that buying a CPU and high-end motherboard for less than what the Intel CPU is going for is a bad choice when you only get a 20 to 30% performance bump for going Team Blue. AMD takes home the prize in my eyes. However, as I mentioned before, it's not that there's no place for the 7820X. High frequencies and great IPC are definitely worth something, and if you need those over just having the multi-cores, it's a great CPU. If you know you need 8 DIMMs or 128 gigabytes of RAM, it's a better choice over AMD right now. But that's the extent of its victory in my eyes. And if you know you don't need those things, then I don't get why you would buy this CPU. If Intel released this back at Ryzen's launch, then this would be a different conversation as well. Bad memory support, bad software support, and just a bad launch overall marred AMD's release, and Intel could have capitalized on that with such a well-implemented CPU architecture and chipset. But it's been a few months. Motherboard support for RAM frequencies is good on AM4 now, more games are taking advantage of the 8 cores on Ryzen, and AMD has ironed out a lot of the kinks. That, unfortunately, leaves Intel in a very vulnerable position, IMO, and makes it so that I won't consider switching over to X299 anytime soon. But I want to know your thoughts. Do you think that Intel's advantages are worth enough to justify buying these CPUs? Any chance you're upgrading to X299? Ryzen 7 and Ryzen Threadripper, or Intel's X Series i7 and i9? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, but please keep it civil. I don't want to have to banhammer you for making ad hominem attacks or derogatory remarks. But with that, I'm going to wrap it up there. Big thanks again to ASUS South Africa for sending over all the parts necessary to make this video possible. Be sure to hit that like button if you like this video and what I do here on this channel. Hit that subscribe button to stay up to date on all of my tech-related videos. I'm Brett with the UF Disciple channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers.